welcome to you all. And I'd like also, as a Bundjalung man, to acknowledge the Gadigal traditional owners of the land on which we now meet. And I'd like to introduce Rachel Perkins and Darren Dale. As you heard, documentary filmmakers who produced that incredible series which was screened on SBS, First Australians. But they're also the principals of Blackfella Films, which of course is the production company that made First Australians. I really think I should begin by, with a kind of act of congratulation. I was transfixed across the series. Did you have any idea when you kind of started out, this kind of history that would chronicle the contemporary Aboriginal experience since invasion? Did you have any idea of the kind of how big that project was?
Looking at each other. I don't think we had any idea about the scope and scale of the project when we first embarked upon it. The genesis of the project was SBS approached Rachel and I, and the brief was very wide open that they wanted to tell the history of Indigenous Australia. So with a brief that big, that's when really the creative process started, and it was a long process, but Rachel can speak about, I guess, the early inception and how the series came to be, and one of the key interviewees in the series was sort of central to the idea and the genesis of the series happening.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Darren's referring to Marcia, I think, Langton, who is a professor of, she's a professor. She sort of studies across, or writes about many, many things. She was key in sort of shepherding us through the project. We sort of relied on her. I mean, we were terrified at the beginning. We were really, I hate to swear, but we were like shit scared, because they said to us, do a history of Indigenous Australia. And as an Aboriginal filmmaker, it's the thing you most want to hear from a broadcaster. Here's lots of money, go out and make the story of your people, And so it's like, wow, I feel like we've been put on the planet to do this, and yet the thought of trying to do such a almost undoable thing is quite daunting. And in fact, it's impossible to tell the history of a people and a country in something as limited as television and, only 7 hours of it. And so I suppose that was the sort of bittersweet nature of it, I suppose, is how limiting television was to actually capture what is an epic, incredibly epic story. I mean, one of the things we struggled with early on was how we managed to tell what they call technically prehistory, the period before European occupation, and it was a great deal of sort of pain and angst to us to try and contain that story plus the sort of the colonial history and then post-colonial history into one thing. And we realised early on that, in fact, we couldn't do that. We couldn't serve all of those answers, and to try and do that would be to diminish, all of those stories. So we decided to try and condense Indigenous occupation into 3 minutes of television.
It was a scintillating 3 minutes, though.
Yeah. Anyway, so it was, to answer your question, yes, it was really daunting for me. I felt very daunted by it, but the fear was a great motivator.
Well, I'm absolutely honest when I say it was, by condensing Aboriginal prehistory into those 3 minutes, you did it so well because you evoked all the spirits of the land and this whole notion of dreaming, and I think it really covered it because you talked about each of the ancestor spirits belonging to people in Northern Australia, in Central Australia, and to people in the East. So I think you did it beautifully. Let's talk about the kind of filmic aspects of making First Australians. One of the things that really strikes me about historical documentary as a genre, you photograph the photograph. So you find these old images, these old stills, and some of the most penetrating images on screen during First Australians are those black and white images of, say, Simon Wonga and William Burruck from Corranderk, and the old colonial etchings of Truganini. Talk about the research in finding those stills, because we're here for Half Light, this incredible exhibition of portraits from Black Australia. but talk about, the still and its role in First Australians. It plays a very important part.
Over to you. No. Yeah, look, I can talk a little bit about the process and how we came to find the images. Rachel met an Aboriginal woman from Tasmania who was working at the South Australian Museum, and her name was Lee Gardam. And she spent 2 years going through all of the archives across the country to look at those photographs. And in the instance you talk about William Barak, it was in fact Lee finding some of those photographs and showing them to Rachel that inspired them to further research that story. And that image really led us to the whole Corandurk story. That was something, and I guess it's an important thing to say, like a lot of the history was unknown to both Rachel and I. So as Aboriginal people, a lot of the history wasn't something that we knew a great deal about or in depth, and we thought that we knew quite a bit. So yeah, the power of the image is that significant that it really led us onto which we ended up telling a whole 52-minute episode about two significant men who are sort of very little known in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Darren says, it was very image-driven because we were working in a visual medium. You need to tell, unlike a book where you can, explore everything in detail and you don't need a pictorial, you can describe it and you don't need a picture. Television is a audio-visual, they say, medium, and we needed images. And so part of our decisions about which stories we would tell were driven by, unfortunately, what visual record there were around a character there existed. So, for instance, say a character like Awaye, who's an Aboriginal woman, fascinating woman, who was active in Tasmania in the period around the late 1820s to, I think she died in early 1840s, and was a guerrilla fighter and said great things like, I hate white men like a black snake, and, I'll kill anyone I see, and fantastic, quite violent things, but, from a dramatic point of view, exciting. We didn't know how to deal with her character, so we'd have to have, shots of landscape, and after a while, shots of trees can get a bit dull. So, but then we found characters like, for instance, William Barak. I went to, early on in the research, when we were still forming the shape of the series, and we knew it would be character-driven because, we'd met with Ken Burns and he'd said, some of you will know Ken Burns has worked the Civil War and jazz and baseball, and he's just done a 13-hour series on the Second World War. Anyway, he's sort of the epic documentary maker. He said to us, I think you just need to tell it about people and make it simple and chronological. Anyway, we took his advice. So I went to Canberra, and there's an institution called the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which has the biggest collection of cinema, film and audio recordings. In fact, the biggest collection of Indigenous material anywhere in the world. And I just said, look, show me everything you've got before 1901. So they just gave me everything, and I just spent some time looking through all of these images, and these images of this fantastic, noble sort of man kept coming up, William Barak. And I was like, who is this William Barak? And literally there were probably like 30 photographs of him between 1860 and 1890, and that's very unusual, let me say, for an Indigenous person to be photographed at all, because we were, photographs were only really taken of people with money and wealth, and there were occasionally ethnographic photographers who took photos of Indigenous people, but very hard to find lots of photographs of the same Indigenous person. So he appeared out of the records. And then I read his story, and then we realised this is an episode, and it's a fantastic story, his life. So the photographic record was very important to us and extremely precious. And in places like Victoria, we found that people had photographs because of these early ethnographic photographers who'd gone out there with the most, what's now seen as very primitive technology. They'd photographed Aboriginal people in the 1860s, right on the cusp of, modern photography, and they'd photographed these Indigenous people, and now Aboriginal Victorians have photos of their ancestors, their great-grandmothers, their great-great-grandmothers. I mean, it's extraordinarily rich heritage that those people can inherit because of these early ethnographic photographers. So we really used people's work, like the Walter and Kruger photographs, first photographs taken in Victoria, early photographers like Baldwin and Spencer, who took extraordinary photographs all through Central Australia and Northern Australia, and they formed the body of our work. And then eventually we moved into Indigenous photographers as Indigenous people picked up the cameras, in the 60s, 70s and 80s. People like Mervyn Bishop, who's in this collection, we used his work and others. So, the work the photographic work traces the sort of evolution of relationships too in Australia and the empowerment of Indigenous people taking over the means of telling their own stories, really.
And I guess that's the kind of project that you're both engaged in with First Australians. It's, our telling of Australian history from our perspective, and it's never really been attempted in the audiovisual, in the kind of film or television sense. What I also loved about First Australians is you talked about having to show images of like lakes and trees, but the cinematography in First Australians is, it's a visual cue. It reminds the viewer of what was at stake in the takeover of Australia. So I think, those images aren't throwaway at all. Talk about that, the cinematographics of First Australians, because Warwick Thornton, I think, was one of the cinematographers, himself a very fine filmmaker. Talk about the cinematography, and going out on location and finding those places that you had to photograph.
I might just recount, in the process of making First Australians, there was a decision to be made about whether we should use recreations. So, recreating what it was like at, when the first fleet arrived.
I was going to say, I'm glad you avoided the reenactment.
Yeah, and that was something that we'd looked at films overseas, and we'd gone to there's a history sort of filmmakers conference that's held every year, and Rachel and I saw lots of examples, and recreations were very popular, and we were sort of erring to the side of not using them. But we went to this conference and we saw work that really pushed recreation beyond the edge, and people were starting to make up things that, historical characters had said, and it wasn't based on records. And so I think that was the final nail in the coffin really for us, about coming to the decision that we wouldn't use recreations in the series. And as part of the series, we consulted with Aboriginal people around the country, and we probably met with over 300 or so Indigenous people. But one of those people was Ricky Maynard, who is actually his photographs. He's, a fine photographer, and he's in the Half-Light exhibition. And we went and consulted with Ricky as a Tasmanian Aboriginal man, and he asked us about what the process was going to be, because he was very concerned about how we would represent colonial Tasmania. And we told him that we were going to go to the places where events had happened and use the power of that image and being located in that place. And he was, it was great for someone of his sort of standing and his respect to say, actually, I think you've made a really great decision not to go down the recreation path.
Yeah, and I think what we did do, though, which was really probably extremely indulgent from our point of view, and probably no one else knows, apart from the people who come from those communities, is we filmed everything on the locations where it happened. So, we'd travel bloody, hundreds of kilometres to a place, where, for instance, Jalkabotta as a young Aranda boy had seen the missionaries come across the Fink River, in 1890s, the first white people to arrive in Central Australia. And we filmed there, exactly in that country. And, in New South Wales, for instance, we filmed, at Dawes Point and around the harbour on, Cumragold land, where the Cumragold people came from and where the ceremonies happened. So we felt really that we wanted to have integrity about the landscape and the country and the places we were showing. And part of our consultation process that Darren mentioned was consulting very closely with communities, but clearing access for rights to film in their country, even though their rights might not be recognised as freehold land owners or native title holders, as many Indigenous people are unable now to secure those rights because of the legislative framework that's around native title. But we felt an obligation to, have their permission to do that. So it was a very close collaboration with the communities that we work with in that sense. But yeah, that for people who are from that area, translates hopefully for them to show that it has, integrity, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can imagine the way you've been thinking prior to that. I mean, you can't photograph Tasmania when you're talking about, Sydney in 1788. You've got to photograph that corner of Sydney that looks like it was, untouched. Kind of just touching on Half-Light, the exhibition upstairs. blackfella films. I understand Michael Riley, the photographer, the great documentary filmmaker and filmmaker, was also, was a great friend of yours. Yeah. So I mean, and some of those images from his films, I think, and some of the images you can see upstairs, they're quite incredible. Can you talk about maybe the kind of, and I can actually see some correlations between Riley's filmmaking and some of the moving images in First Australians. I hope I'm not seeing something that's not there. Has he had an impact on you creatively?
Yeah, I think Michael Riley was a visionary and as an artist, and he was a photographer first before he became a filmmaker, and I think that lent his work a very strong visual style, and his films are about the image, predominantly, and also about his Indigenous view through the lens, which is very specific. And I think, if you have a look at Half Light, you'll see a strong perspective, an Indigenous perspective show through that work. So, yes, I mean, he's had a very big influence on my work, and was a previous director of the company that Darren and I now share. So, he was an exceptional artist.
So, what's been the reaction then to First Australians? I mean, it was screened towards the end of last year, well, kind of more towards the middle of last year. What's been the reaction that you've heard?
Look, I think we've been overwhelmed by, I guess that most of the reaction that we've had has been overly positive, which has been fantastic, but you're always so nervous. Like, we worked on the series for 6 years, and we're obviously nervous about the way people perceived it. There was a huge website that's been done in conjunction with the series, and really that's got comments from individuals and Aboriginal people. There's been people with dissent, Aboriginal people, particularly on the website, has been the main interface for us to gauge, apart from people saying, fantastic, you've done a great job, but it's always good to try and canvass other opinion. But there's been people, people have felt, why didn't we cover their nation? And we probably touch on about 30 Aboriginal language groups or nations in the country in the whole history. So that's something, I guess, that, we always knew that we couldn't tell every story. But, overwhelmingly positive, I would say. And, it just shows that there's so many more stories out there that, need to be told.
My last question is probably a bit curly, but I'm going to ask it anyway. First Australians, I guess, was being imagined and thought of at a time in very recent history when there was a huge debate, a lot of political intervention in historical debates, that period that we call the history wars or the culture wars. How did you make it as some kind of salvo in those history wars? Did you ever think about what was going on in wider debates about how Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal history was being denied on a political level? Did you ever think about this as being some kind of salve, some kind of healing balm that might kind of correct the public record, which was which was deteriorating at a rate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the press had been dominated, particularly the Australian newspaper, with the whole Wind Shuttle series of books. He had an open range, basically sponsored publication of his view on things. And, for many years, Indigenous people, well, let's say actually, except for the last 20 years, Indigenous people have been left out of the record. It's been the most extraordinary whitewash of the true nature of this country. And in the last 20 years, Indigenous historians, non-Indigenous historians have been, devoting their lives to putting back a more holistic version of the nature of this country. So for us, this was an opportunity to say, well, here it is to the public from an Indigenous point of view, and this is part of our story, and so listen to this, and it was very important. That perspective has never been put and it certainly wasn't on SBS, because SBS is not mainstream. Only about 1.5 million people saw it. So we're still talking about a very small audience. But yes, we felt like this is our version of it. But we were very conscious of the fact that the history wars were raging and selling newspapers, so we were extremely vigilant about our source material. We had each script was reviewed by up to 10 historians and the community people. Every cut of the film, so at rough cut, what we call rough cut, fine cut and lock off, was reviewed by historians and community members. So we showed probably the film to probably about 50 or 60 people roughly at each process. So our process was watertight. Except for one ad that the advertising company did, and I didn't check because I was doing something else, that we got, of course, caught up on. And people then called into question the whole validity of the series based on one advertisement. But that's why you have to be vigilant. But I think, we tried our best to do it.
And I think absolutely, the history wars raging had a real impact. For instance, Lyndall Ryan, who was interviewed in the Tasmanian episode, she'd had her work pulled apart and, as Rachel said, via the Australian, her work dissected and mistakes published. And she was one of the people that we'd interviewed for episode 2, and she was one of the people that actually gave us comment on. And the veracity that she used to go over that episode and the notes on the finest detail was so detailed, and that was really brought about by the culture that had come about in talking about massacres. Was it 12 people that were killed, or was it 25 people that were killed? And I think we started to lose sight of the fact that what we're focusing on is the terrible bloodshed and the violence and what the frontier was like, and it reduced the whole debate about numbers and people. So I think we certainly tried to, address that in the films.
I mean, it became incredibly forensic. The wind shuttle, wouldn't accept that an Aboriginal person had died unless there was documentary evidence, and of course documentary evidence is only produced by non-Indigenous people at that period in history. It was very forensic.
And look, I think that's good, because I think, history is... it is contested. And the thing that we discovered about history, which we didn't know before because we weren't scholars of it, was that history is not a agreed fact of the way things happened, It's actually just the teller's view. And when you talk about perspective, this was our view of it. And it's not necessarily right and it's not necessarily correct, but we think it's correct, But someone else would look at the same records and interpret them differently, and that is history, And the horrifying thing is that in 60 years' time, people will look at First Australians and they'll go, God, that's old-fashioned. I can't believe they said that. And, we totally look at it differently now. And as we did to other people's work, to earlier historians' work, we were quite sometimes dismissive of their work. And people will be of ours, and the historical record and the interpretation of it evolves and goes on. So, this is just a part of it, and it reflects, I think, the time we're in now, and it will change,
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you both, and if you haven't seen either Half-Light or the documentary series First Australians, I mean, you should go and find it. You can find it at most bookstores. There's also a beautiful hardcover book about the series and about the stories contained within First Australian. So if you'd like to join me in thanking Rachel Perkins and Darren Dale.
Thank you. Thanks.